Well, this is very challenging, no doubt. But, he's got kind of a point about Washington. Um, but as he says here, this is the key claim, I think, on page 98, first column, at the end of the first paragraph, when he says the word nothing and the word Washington clearly do not have the same referent. Well, that sounds plausible. Now, what is, again, a referent? If I say the White House, the referent is the building that we could find in Washington, D.C. If I say the Grand Canyon, the referent is the gigantic hole in the ground that we can find somewhere out west. And clearly, those two words, those two expressions, the White House and the Grand Canyon, have different reference. They do not have the same referent. Well, he's saying something, he's saying this exact same thing, in fact, about the words nothing and the words Washington or George Washington or George Washington, the first president of the United States. That is, they do not refer to the same thing. But there's a complication, obviously, because we know that Washington is dead. Now, if I say the White House, I'm confident that it has a referent. I can go out and find it. If I say the Grand Canyon, I'm confident there's a referent. I can go out and find it. If I try to find the referent to Washington, I can't go out and find it. At one time, I could by finding the man, but he's gone. Now, the claim here, though, is that we are still able to talk about him. That is, we're still able to discuss George Washington, which is absolutely true. And his inference from that, I suppose, is that there still is a referent when it comes to dead people like Washington. We're not referring to nothing, we're referring to something. Now, what the something is what is at issue here, because whatever the something is that Washington still is, supposedly, it's not the same something as he was when he was alive. I think we all have to, you, me, and Hartshorne all have to acknowledge that. But the implication is, I suppose, that if we can still refer to him, there must still be a referent to refer to. And if there's still a referent to refer to, then Washington, in some sense or another, well, here language becomes difficult. I was going to say he still exists, but at the end of this paragraph, he asked the question, in what sense is the no longer existent nevertheless still something? So that would imply that Hartshorne believes that Washington no longer exists, yet Washington still is something, which would involve us, I suppose, in having to defend a certain terminological distinction between existence and being something, which we usually say that things which don't exist aren't anything, aren't a something. But I suppose the idea is that something can be a something when it no longer exists. Okay, that's difficult, but intriguing. Here in the second column, he also uses some new terminology about real. He says, to me at least, he says, it is a truism, that is an obvious truth, though one often forgotten, that whatever death may mean, it cannot mean that a man is first something real and then something unreal. He may first be something unreal and then something real, which would be, coming into existence and birth. But this is only an unnecessarily paradoxical way of saying that once there was neither the name George Washington, for example, nor any name with the meaning which that term now has, that is, before Washington was born, and also that there was no individual person, such as the one we now call George Washington, either as real or as unreal. As soon as there was this particular he, there was a real he. we may not really understand coming into existence. We may not really understand what it means to be born, to become a new being. And that would be an interesting investigation. But he's willing to, in fact, he's adamantly saying that before Washington was born, there was no referent to George Washington. After he was born, there was, and there continues to be after he dies. That before Washington was born, he was nothing real. He was nothing. After he was born, he became something real. And having become real, he cannot become unreal, seems to be the suggestion. Every he or she, he continues, is real. But there are new he's and she's each moment. But once an individual is there to refer to, he continues to be there even after death as object of reference, as a life which really has been lived. The only question is, was it there all along as a life that was going to be lived? And there he gets into some questions of time, having to do with quantum physics or relativity physics. I thought it was quantum physics, actually, which he eventually says he doesn't really understand, and neither do I, so it can be safely disregarded. The real claim here is that once we are something, we cannot become nothing. That makes no sense. So really, in certain ways, it's similar to Plato and the Bhagavad Gita. The notion that the human self, or whatever we are, is permanent in some respect. Now, take his argument for what it is. I suppose it is a metaphysical argument, or it is a metaphysical vision. That is, when I say metaphysical, I don't mean anything really spiritual or grand, but he's making certain basic claims about reality that are very difficult to verify. He's making claims about being, about the impossibility of thinking of being becoming nothing, the impossibility of the real becoming the unreal, and certain distinctions between being a something and still existing, which are all metaphysical claims. But take it for what you will. It is quite interesting. And then really then the question becomes, what exactly are we once we die? If we continue to be something, it's certainly not the same something we were when we were alive. So that's, and this gets into kind of the interesting aspect of this essay, which is this notion of the book of life as a way of conceiving what I'm presenting to you as a kind of compromise or second best alternative to the kind of afterlife that thinkers like Plato and Landsberg describe.